There's been another night of rioting across the United States as anger over police racism and brutality shows no sign of letting up. The protest over the death of 46-year-old George Floyd began peacefully last week in Minneapolis. The police officer who knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 3 of his colleagues have now been fired. But 1 week on from George Floyd's death, demonstrations have stretched throughout the country, becoming larger and more violent as tensions escalate. Now US officials say they're trying to determine if outside groups have infiltrated the protest and deliberately inflamed the situation. Hermione G has more.
From Boston to San Francisco, protesters have ignored curfews in at least 40 cities as they took to the streets for a 6th night. The demonstrations were ignited by the May 25th death of an unarmed African-American man, George Floyd, at the hands of a white police officer. Once again, the protests reached the White House, where chants could be heard from around 1,000 demonstrators just across the street in Lafayette Park, as they faced police in riot gear behind barricades. Police used flashbangs to stop another group from reaching the park. Across the nation, demonstrators called for an end to police violence, but many also joined officers in pleading for an end to the fires, vandalism and looting. The Trump administration has branded instigators domestic terrorists. President Donald Trump tweeted demanding law and order now. They're looting stores. Call in our National Guard. At one point, a truck in Minnesota appeared to be driven deliberately into protesters, although no injuries have been reported. Video footage of George Floyd's arrest showed him handcuffed and pleading for air as a white police officer pressed a knee on his neck for several minutes. The officer, Derek Chauvin, has been charged with third-degree murder, and 4 others have been sacked. On Sunday, Minnesota's governor brought in thousands of National Guard soldiers in a show of force to help quell the violence. Hermione G, Euronews.
Well, let's speak to our reporter Ray Suarez now, who's in Washington covering this story for us. Ray, I understand you saw some of these protests and demonstrations as they kicked off, and there were fires near the White House. Tell us more about what you saw.
I went down to the White House earlier this evening. The mayor of Washington, D.C. had earlier said that no curfew was going to be necessary in the nation's capital because the kind of people who cause trouble don't really pay attention to curfews. She went back on her own word and closed down the city from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning the next day. And the park in front of the White House was crowded. There was a heavy police presence, but things were pretty peaceful. There was chanting, there was pressure up against the barriers, but there was also a cordon sanitaire between the demonstrators and the police. But a few minutes before 11 o'clock, as curfew approached, the police began to move to clear the park in front of the White House, and that's when the trouble began. A small group of protesters refused to leave the park while others streamed away toward the exits, and then another small group began to set fires in the area, to cars, to nearby office buildings, including the offices of the nation's largest trade union group, which was on fire shortly after 11 o'clock, along with part of what's called the Church of the Presidents, St. John's Episcopal Church, just across Lafayette Park from the White House, attended at one time or another by all modern presidents since the 19th century.
Ray, you mentioned the presidents there, and let me speak about the current president, Trump, who's deemed the Antifa, the left-wing activists, blaming them for these protests, saying that they're stoking tensions there. Is there any evidence for this?
Well, there are unidentified and unidentifiable groups of young men, a small subset of the overall protesters who've taken to the streets, who set about breaking things, setting things on fire, vandalizing not only vehicles and buildings, but also setting off confrontations with the police and burning police cars. Some of these people have attracted attention not only from the police, but from other demonstrators themselves who scold them, who say, "What are you doing? Who are you?" and demand to know where they're from and who they are. But often they'll set off the mayhem and then run away, not facing arrest or identification. It is unclear in some of the cases. In several of the cities, the arresting officers have said that many of the people they're picking up are not from where they're being arrested. So they are outsiders who are traveling to these areas to become involved in the protests. There are a lot of groups with a lot of different agendas and a lot of work that remains to be done to figure out who's doing what and for what ends.
Perhaps some of these tensions are also being flamed by news that the autopsy regarding George Floyd suggests that there was underlying issues and they may be responsible for his death. How's news of that being received?
Well, it's been received very unhappily, and some lawyers are advising the Floyd family to get an independent pathology report. The original investigation, the original post-mortem, said that asphyxiation and strangulation did not contribute to George Floyd's death, suggesting that heart ailments and other issues caused his death, perhaps aggravated by the police officer on his neck, but that he was not strangled to death. This is not sitting well with the crowds who've come to see this as an almost deliberate act on the part of the police. He's been charged, Mr. Chauvin, with third-degree murder, which means without intent to kill, but with depraved indifference, is the language in the law, depraved indifference to the well-being of the person that he was mistreating, that ended in death. So it's somewhat less than a murder charge that would say, yes, I intended and moved on this person with intent to kill them. And crowds are not very happy with that lesser murder charge as well.
Ray Suarez there. We should also point out the 3 other officers involved have been fired as well. Ray Suarez reporting from Washington. Thank you. Well, all around the world, protesters turned out in their thousands to add their voices to the outrage at the killing of George Floyd. In London, crowds chanting "No justice, no peace" gathered in Trafalgar Square before marching to the US Embassy. Similar events took place in Berlin and Copenhagen, while Russian authorities condemned the, quote, lawless conduct of US police.